On my granddaughter's birthday, while laughter and conversation filled the backyard, my son quietly tugged my sleeve 4 times. In that instant, a chill ran through me. It was the old signal, the secret code we hadn't used in more than 20 years. When we finally stepped away from the crowd and I asked him why he used it, my son told me something that nearly made my legs give out. What he revealed exposed the crimes of a devil who had spent years hiding behind the perfect disguise. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for being here. Take a second to comment and tell me where you're watching from. I always love seeing our community around the world. And a quick note, some details have been adjusted for storytelling and educational purposes, but the message remains true. The moment my son tugged at the sleeve of my jacket, I didn't look at his face. My eyes went straight to my watch, 3:14 p.m. In my mind, that second marked the quiet end of my retirement and the instant my old instincts took control again. My name is Calder Whitlock. I'm 66 years old, and after spending 28 years wearing the badge of the Oregon State Police, I believed I had seen every disguise a monster could hide behind. Retirement in Portland was supposed to be simple. Most of my days were meant to revolve around fixing loose boards on the cedar deck and chasing squirrels away from the bird feeder in the yard. But the pressure on my arm wasn't just a casual touch. It was a signal, a code I had taught my son long ago and never expected to see again. The grip on my sleeve carried a frantic rhythm, the silent pulse of a man who was drowning while standing on solid ground. My son, Rowan Whitlock, is 32. He works as a draftsman, a quiet man who has spent years trying to outrun mistakes from his past. Those mistakes left him with a dangerous trait, an eagerness to believe in second chances, even when the person offering them doesn't deserve the trust. He stood beside me near the gift table, while the backyard buzzed with the noisy chaos of my granddaughter Ria's second birthday party. The air smelled of grilled chicken, sweet cake frosting, and the constant shriek of laughing children. Rowan tugged my sleeve once more harder, this time his eyes flicking toward the center of the yard, as if he didn't dare speak out loud. I followed his gaze. That was when I realized the gathering wasn't just a birthday celebration, it was something else entirely. Something carefully orchestrated. Near the grill stood Delilah, my daughter-in-law of 3 years. She was 34 and worked in what she liked to call boutique investment consulting, the kind of business that always seemed to benefit the house more than the players. She was surrounded by our wealthiest neighbors, the Millers and the Kensingtons, speaking with a confidence that made her appear completely at home in the center of attention. Her posture was flawless. Her smile shone with the same bright polish as the expensive Chardonnay sparkling in the glass she held loosely in her hand. I took a slow sip from my own drink, letting the oaky taste settle on my tongue. It did nothing to calm the uneasy vibration forming in my gut. When you spend 3 decades hunting wolves, you eventually learn to sense the iron scent of blood long before they show their teeth. From where I stood, I watched Delilah motion toward a glossy stack of papers resting on the patio table. Even over the laughter of the children and the music drifting from a speaker by the fence, her voice carried just far enough for me to catch fragments of what she was saying. Rowan tugged my sleeve again, this time with urgency. It was the second time. His fingers tightened briefly, a silent plea he couldn't bring himself to voice. Delilah leaned slightly closer to Mr. Miller, her body language relaxed but calculated. She spoke with the practiced warmth of someone who had rehearsed every word. I caught a phrase drifting through the noise of the party-limited intake window. That phrase always made my ears ring. It usually came moments before someone's savings disappeared. I set my glass down and stepped closer, letting my eyes scan the scene with the cold, methodical attention of a crime scene investigator. My mind cataloged details automatically: body language, positioning, tone of voice. Delilah noticed me approaching. To her credit, she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned with effortless grace, tilting her head slightly as she welcomed me into the circle with a polite gesture. Then she said the word that made my skin crawl. She looked directly at Mr. Miller and described something she called the Cascade Fund, presenting it as a vehicle for frictionless capital. The phrase struck my memory like a hammer against steel. Inside my head, old case files opened instantly. 5 years earlier, I had investigated a fraud ring operating in the Medford district. They used that exact phrase, frictionless capital, to lure retirees into transferring their retirement accounts into shell funds that vanished overnight. By the time the victims realized what had happened, their 401ks were empty and the operators were gone. Rowan tugged my sleeve a third time. I glanced down and saw how pale his face had become under the afternoon sun. In that moment, I understood something important. My son wasn't just uncomfortable, he was terrified. The warm May sunlight suddenly felt less like a summer afternoon, and more like the harsh glare of an interrogation lamp. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of authority return to my posture. Slowly, I lifted my eyes and locked them on the woman my son had married. Delilah met my gaze without hesitation. Her smile didn't falter. It was flawless, polished, and cold like a diamond cut to perfection. And that was when the realization finally settled into place. I wasn't just a father attending his granddaughter's birthday party. I was a target, and the woman standing in front of me was quietly measuring the distance between the knife and my back. I watched the wine turn slowly in Delilah's glass, a pale, expensive amber catching the late afternoon light, while my son tugged at my sleeve with the quiet strength of a man drowning in perfectly calm water. The smile she wore across the yard wasn't simply directed at the neighbors gathered around the grill. It was something wider, something colder. It felt like a net tightening around the branches of my entire family tree. Rowan said nothing. He didn't have to. The tension in his grip spoke loudly enough to echo through my bones. I let him guide me away from the laughter and the clinking of silverware. We drifted past the folding tables and paper plates toward the back of the yard, where the old cedar fence stood weathered and gray beneath the afternoon sun. The scent of damp mulch and cedar bark hung in the air, and the tall laurel hedge cast a shadow that offered just enough privacy for a conversation no one else needed to hear. That was when he did it, the fourth tug, sharp, rhythmic, urgent. It bypassed the thinking part of my brain and went straight to the adrenaline that had kept me alive through 28 years of police work. "Don't look back, Dad," he muttered under his breath, his voice tight as if he were physically restraining something inside himself. "Just walk with me." We stopped in the narrow strip of shade along the hedge. I turned to face him, my voice lowering automatically into the calm, controlled tone I used when a perimeter had been breached. "I felt it, Rowan," I said quietly. "I'm here. Tell me." He swallowed, and I noticed how wide his pupils were so dilated they nearly erased the calm blue of his eyes. "Dad." "She already moved a check," he whispered. The words spilled out quickly as though they had been building pressure inside his chest. "A pre-allocation check. From our joint account." She didn't even wait for my final signature. She just took it. For a moment, the air in my lungs turned heavy, as if the oxygen had thickened into cold metal. The cheerful noise from the party faded into a distant blur, leaving only a sharp, high frequency ringing through my thoughts. My mind was usually a fortress-structured, analytical, controlled. But betrayal has a way of slipping through the smallest cracks. How many fathers spend decades building a bridge of trust for their children, only to watch someone else strike a match and burn it down with a smile and a glass of Chardonnay? What Delilah had done wasn't just about money. It was an intrusion, a violation of the quiet sanctuary I had spent a lifetime trying to build for my son. Without warning, my memory pulled me backward through time. Christmas dinner, 1999. Rowan was 7 years old, trapped politely in the corner of the living room, while my brother Vernon explained municipal sewage infrastructure with the patience of a man who never realized he had lost his audience 20 minutes earlier. Rowan's eyes had glazed over back then, the same way they looked now. To rescue him without embarrassing Vernon or creating a family argument, I had invented a simple code. 3 tugs on my sleeve meant the exit door was open, and I was coming to get him. We hadn't used that signal since his freshman year of college, and yet here it was again. Not as a childhood escape route, but as a distress flare from a man who felt trapped in his own life. The memory didn't comfort me. It sharpened something inside me, like steel drawn slowly across a whetstone. I studied my son carefully, seeing both the 32-year-old man standing in front of me and the anxious boy who once needed help escaping a corner of the room. "It's worse than the money, Dad," he said, his voice rough and uneven. The nearby sprinkler system hissed rhythmically against the lawn, its steady pulse underscoring every word. "She's been coaching Rhea." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head, as if the idea still sounded unbelievable even to him. "She's teaching her phrases," he said quietly. "Investment growth, cascade fund. She repeats them when you're around." My stomach tightened. "She's using the baby dad." Rowan continued. "She knows you soften when Rhea talks. She's trying to make it sound innocent, like the idea came from a child." A bitter metallic taste crept into my mouth as adrenaline surged through my system. I glanced back toward the house. Through the sliding glass doors, I could see Delilah moving confidently through the living room, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the interior lights. She looked comfortable, relaxed, like someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. Rowan exhaled slowly, his hand finally dropping from my sleeve. "She isn't waiting for me to say yes anymore, Dad," he said. Then he met my eyes with a look that carried equal parts fear and resignation. "She's already started the transfer." There is a particular kind of silence that follows the discovery of a crime. It is not the peaceful quiet of an empty house, but a dense, hollow stillness, a ringing in the ears that every person who has ever worn a badge eventually learns to recognize. When the last of the birthday guests drifted out and the backyard gate clicked shut behind them, that silence settled over my home like a heavy shroud. The party lights still glowed faintly across the patio, but the laughter had vanished. Rowan had already left with Delilah, his expression carefully arranged into a calm mask that didn't fool me for a second. I knew my son well enough to see the tension beneath it. What he had told me near the cedar fence, the unauthorized transfer already set in motion, sat inside my stomach like a jagged hook that tightened every time I breathed. I stood in the kitchen while the dishwasher began its steady mechanical hum. The sweet smell of leftover birthday cake mixed uneasily with the sterile scent of dish soap and warm water. Across the counter, my wife Ilara moved quietly through the cleanup. Ilara had spent 35 years as a school principal. She possessed the rare ability to detect dishonesty from across a crowded gymnasium full of teenagers. Now she was watching the empty doorway with the same quiet, analytical stillness I felt inside my own chest. She didn't ask what Rowan had whispered to me near the fence. She already knew something was wrong. "Calder," she said, quietly stacking the last of the plates. Her voice carried that calm tone she used when the truth was already obvious. "You saw it too, didn't you?" I looked up. That look in her eyes when the neighbors mentioned their trust funds, she continued. That wasn't curiosity. It was inventory. I nodded slowly. The linen shirt I was still wearing from the party suddenly felt heavier than it should have. "He used the signal," I said. Ilara's hands paused. 4 tugs, I continued. "He hasn't used that since he was a kid. He's terrified." I leaned against the counter and exhaled slowly. He told me Delilah already started moving money from their joint account. No consent. No final signature. Ilara froze with a plate halfway to the cabinet. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she set the plate down carefully. "She told me something too," Ilara said quietly. While we were clearing the snack table earlier, I noticed Delilah's phone sitting face down beside the chairs. She looked at me directly. There was a voice recorder running. I felt the muscles in my neck tighten. She left it recording while we were talking. Ilara continued. She wasn't just joining the family, Calder. Her voice dropped slightly. She was documenting it. Marriage is supposed to be built on trust. But when that trust becomes a weapon, it turns into something corrosive, a slow poison that eats through the heart long before the victim realizes what has happened. We finished cleaning the kitchen in a strange, quiet rhythm. Neither of us said much more. Some conversations don't require words. By midnight, the house was finally dark, but sleep refused to come. Rain began tapping softly against the bedroom window, the sound growing into a steady, restless rhythm that blended with the ticking of the hallway clock. I lay there staring into the darkness, replaying every detail of the evening in my mind. At exactly 11:47 p.m., my phone vibrated on the nightstand. The sudden buzz made my skin tighten. I picked it up and saw a message from Rowan. "I can't wait until the weekend. I'm coming over tomorrow at 7. Please don't tell Delilah." I stared at the words for a moment before responding. Whatever she started, Rowan were ending it tomorrow. After sending the message, I slid quietly out of bed and walked down the hall toward my study. The room smelled the way it always had, old paper dust, and the cold metallic scent of the steel desk I had used for nearly 3 decades of casework. The familiar environment steadied my breathing. I sat down and woke the computer. The pale blue light of the screen cut through the darkness like a thin blade. If Delilah had already breached Rowan's finances, there was only one question left to answer. Had she breached mine? I opened the home security interface and began reviewing the remote access logs. My fingers moved automatically, guided by a kind of muscle memory I hadn't used since the last days of my career. Scroll, timestamp, log in source, scroll again. Then my blood turned cold. The log showed dozens of remote entries over the past 3 weeks. Each login had been made using Rowan's credentials, and every one of them occurred late at night, hours, when I knew my son would have been asleep. I leaned closer to the screen, my pulse beginning to hammer against my throat. Delilah hadn't simply been draining Rowan's savings. She had been using his access to dig into my digital life, my personal files, financial records, and private archives. I stared at the glowing screen as the truth finally settled into place. The predator wasn't circling the perimeter anymore. She had already slipped inside the vault. I was already halfway through my third cup of black coffee when the headlights of Rowan's truck swept across the kitchen wall. The light moved in uneven streaks jerking across the cabinets and refrigerator, not the steady approach of a man coming home, but the frantic path of someone trying to outrun something close behind him. The discovery from the night before still sat heavily in my mind. Learning that Delilah had been quietly stripping away my digital privacy while I slept left a sour metallic taste in my mouth that no amount of caffeine could erase. I opened the back door before Rowan even reached the porch. Outside, the gray Portland dawn was breaking through a curtain of relentless rain. The yard had dissolved into a blur of charcoal soil and slate-colored puddles, the cold drizzle tapping steadily against the roof. Rowan stumbled inside. His denim jacket was soaked through, clinging to his shoulders like a heavy second skin. His hair hung damp against his forehead, and he looked like a man who hadn't closed his eyes in days. Deep shadows pooled beneath his eyes, and his hands trembled with a thin, constant vibration that he couldn't quite control. I pulled a chair away from the kitchen table and guided him down into it. The small room filled with the mingled smells of stale coffee and wet fabric. "You look like hell, son," I said quietly. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I haven't slept, Dad," he admitted, his voice cracking under the strain. "Every time I close my eyes, I see my bank account dropping to zero." He dragged a hand over his face. "It feels like a countdown. I can't stop." Rain rattled softly against the window while the coffee maker clicked behind me. "She didn't just suggest the investment," Rowan continued. "She's already drafted the resignation letter for my brokerage account." I frowned. "What do you mean drafted?" "She typed the whole thing," he said. "All formal, clean, ready to send. She says once I close the account, the money can move straight into the Cascade Fund." He swallowed. "She's got the mobile transfer queued on her phone. All she needs is my fingerprint to authorize the final transfer." The calm precision of it made my skin prickle. There's a difference between a bad investment and a crime. A bad investment leaves you embarrassed. A crime convinces you that you're lucky. That's how the hook sets. Rowan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of documents. He spread them across the kitchen table with shaking hands. The pages were glossy, professionally printed prospectuses for something called the Cascade Private Capital Fund. The paper itself was thick and expensive, embossed with gold foil lettering that caught the dim morning light. Every page radiated exclusivity, an invitation into a world of wealth carefully curated for a select few. "She says it's a friends and family allocation," Rowan whispered. His eyes remained fixed on the documents as if they might suddenly move. "She told me I'm lucky to even have access to it." He paused. "She says the intake window closes at the end of the month." I leaned forward and pulled the stack closer. "In my experience, Rowan," I said, slowly, "the person explaining how lucky you are is usually the one holding the deck." The papers felt heavier than they should have. Inside those 17 pages sat the balance of my son's future $420,000 in retirement savings. His entire 401k. The paper felt too polished, too expensive. Holding it reminded me of something oddly familiar. It felt like the printed program handed out at the funeral of a wealthy man. My eyes began moving across the pages, scanning the text with a professional focus I hadn't felt since the day I turned in my badge. My mind shifted automatically into investigative mode, searching for the small inconsistencies predators always leave behind. Fraud always leaves fingerprints. You just have to know where to look. Legal disclaimers, return projections, asset management structures. I flipped through page after page until I reached the leadership section. That was when my breath caught. Printed neatly near the center of the page was a name: Director of Acquisitions, Griffin Holt. For a moment, the kitchen seemed to shrink around me. I stared at the letters as if they might rearrange themselves into something else, but they didn't. Griffin Holt. The name hit me with the weight of a physical blow. 10 years earlier, during one of the final major cases of my career, that name had surfaced repeatedly during an investigation into a regional Ponzi scheme. The operation had gutted the retirement savings of 50 families across Oregon and Northern California. By the time we closed in, Holt had vanished. No arrest, no body. Just empty bank accounts and a trail that went cold. The case had haunted me long after I retired. Now the ghost from that investigation was sitting on the kitchen table inside a glossy investment brochure. I looked up at Rowan slowly. My pulse had begun hammering steadily in my throat. The realization settled into place piece by piece. Delilah wasn't just a manipulative investor. She wasn't even just a con artist. She was working for the man who had built one of the most devastating financial traps I had ever seen. And that meant something far worse than stolen money. It meant the trap had already been set. I spread the 17 pages across my mahogany desk, like a deck of cards, waiting to see which one would finally reveal the hand Delilah was playing. My study had always been a place of quiet reflection, the air thick with the comforting scent of polished wood and aging paper. Normally, it was a sanctuary for careful thought. This morning, however, it felt more like a command center preparing for a confrontation. Through the closed door, I could hear Rowan pacing in the kitchen. His boots struck the linoleum in slow, restless rhythms that carried through the hallway. My son was waiting for reassurance, for some sign that everything could still be fixed. But as I lifted my jeweler's loupe and leaned closer to the documents, a darker suspicion crept into my mind. What I might find here wasn't a lifeline. It might be a trap already tightening. The document itself was impressive at first glance. Every page looked professionally assembled, dense with legal language and impressive formatting, designed to overwhelm anyone who read it too quickly. I started where fraud often reveals itself inside the legal boilerplate. My eyes scanned line by line, paying attention not to the meaning, but to the structure, the spacing between words, the slight shifts in typeface, the subtle differences in font weight that only show up when a document has been assembled from multiple sources. "Nice font, Delilah," I muttered quietly to the empty room. Too bad the registration number belongs to a dissolved shell company. That was the first crack. The deeper I went, the worse the picture became. Buried inside a wall of dense legal language was a subscription agreement clause that made my pulse spike. The wording was careful, almost elegant, but the meaning was brutal. The clause didn't simply authorize an investment transfer. It granted the fund-sweeping power of attorney over the investor's entire estate in the event of market volatility. In plain terms, it meant that if anything went wrong in the market, the fund could legally take control of everything: savings, assets, property. It wasn't an investment agreement. It was permission for financial annihilation. Do you know why scammers hide the truth in fine print? Because they understand how people read. After the third, whereas in heretofore most eyes glaze over, the brain begins to drift. By the time the dangerous language appears, the reader has already stopped paying attention. Fraud depends on boredom. The thicker the stack of paper, the more legitimate people assume it must be. Most investors see a heavy packet and think it represents authority and credibility. But I spent 28 years learning the opposite lesson. The more paper someone hands you, the more likely they're hiding something inside it. I shifted my attention from the contract language to the physical footprint of the fund itself. According to the prospectus, Cascade Private Capital operated out of a prestigious office on West Georgia Street in Seattle. That address should have belonged to a major financial firm. Instead, when I logged into a private investigative database I still maintained from my years on, the truth surfaced almost immediately. The suite number corresponded to a level 1 mail forwarding service, a $40 a month digital mailbox. The service operated out of a narrow storefront, wedged between a dry cleaner and a travel agency that had been closed for years. No legitimate multi-million-dollar fund conducts business from a strip mall mailbox. Next, I examined the projected returns, 18 to 22% annually. Those numbers weren't just optimistic, they were mathematically impossible. That kind of guaranteed performance was the exact signature used in the Ponzi structure Griffin Holt had deployed 10 years earlier when he drained retirement accounts across 3 states. My hands remained steady as I continued reading, but the air in the room felt heavier with each page I turned. It carried the tense stillness that settles over the Pacific Northwest before a summer thunderstorm. I knew the smell of a hunter's trail, and the scent here was unmistakable. When I reached the final page, however, something stopped me cold. A section labeled Collateral Assets had been customized for the investor profile. At first glance, it listed Rowan's financial accounts. But below those entries appeared something far more disturbing. The document included the exact appraised value of my home. It also listed a detailed inventory estimate for my private coin collection information Rowan himself barely knew. I leaned back slowly. Those details could only have come from my personal financial records. Delilah hadn't just been manipulating Rowan. She had been quietly cataloging my entire life through the digital backdoor I discovered the night before. Then my eyes dropped to the signature block. Tucked into the lower corner of the page was a faint digital watermark, a stylized ghost. It wasn't the mark of any financial institution, but I had seen it once before. Years earlier, it had appeared in a cold case file tied to an international forgery network, specializing in high-value identity theft. I stared at the symbol as the realization settled into place. Delilah wasn't just working for Griffin Holt. She was part of something far larger, a precise instrument inside a machine that operated far beyond our family. I didn't pick up the desk phone. I pulled a burner from the false bottom of my humidor, the keypad light glowing like a predator's eye in the dim study. The smell of old tobacco and cedar clung to the plastic casing as I punched in a number I'd memorized years ago and never intended to use again. I waited the sound of static on the line, humming in my ear, while I watched the rain lash against the window pane. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked Rowan, likely still vibrating with the shock of Griffin Holt's name. When the line finally clicked open, the voice on the other end was sharp, cautious, and unmistakably professional. Calder Michelle Torres asked, her tone shifting from formal to surprised. "You haven't called this line since the 2021 retirement party." Michelle Torres had been my best investigator for 6 years, a woman with the patience of a sniper, and a mind that processed data like a supercomputer. I leaned back into the shadows of my chair, my voice dropping into the low, authoritative frequency. "I've got a dry run being repeated in my own living room, Michelle. I need the deep dive." I told her about the ghost watermark I'd found on the Cascade Fund documents. There was a pause, a heavy silence that lasted 3 beats too long. "That mark isn't just a signature, Calder," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "We've seen it in 3 active Pacific Northwest fraud cases this quarter. Our intel suggests it belongs to a forger currently suspected of working for the Canadian mob, not just some independent ring." The air in my study suddenly felt colder. In my world, a coincidence is just a piece of evidence that hasn't found its partner yet. This wasn't just about a greedy daughter-in-law. This was about an incursion. I provided the name and social security number I'd lifted from Rowan's tax returns, Delilah Mercer. Michelle's keyboard began to clatter a rhythmic, frantic sound that I could hear clearly through the receiver. As she worked, my mind drifted back to the Phantom Fund case of 2018. We'd chased shadows for months while 3 families were systematically stripped of their homes and dignity. That was a dry run too, a test of the fences before the real predators moved in for the kill. "A clean record isn't a sign of innocence," Calder Michelle muttered as the search results populated. "It's a sign of a high-budget janitor. Delilah Mercer's digital footprint is scrubbed so white it's blinding. No social media before 2015, no credit history before she moved to Portland. Check the aliases I told her, my jaw tightening. Look for Sudbury or Mississauga connections." I knew the pattern. Then she went silent. That particular professional silence that meant she'd found the first hole in the lie. I could hear her breathing change, the rhythmic clicking of the mouse slowing down. "Calder, look at this," she whispered. Delilah Mercer's current Oregon driver's license was issued using a birth certificate that was reported stolen from a hospital fire in Ohio 10 years ago. She paused and I felt the hair on my arms stand up. "The woman in your house isn't Delilah Mercer. I just pulled the death certificate from the national database. The real Delilah Mercer died in a car accident in 2014. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, thudding warning. "Stay away from her, Calder. You're living with a ghost." The ghost in my living room had a name, a 3-year marriage, and a daughter, but according to the state of Oregon, she was nothing more than a digital echo of a woman buried in a rain-soaked cemetery a decade ago. I stood by the window of my study, watching the gray Portland rain streak against the glass. The news Michelle had delivered felt like a physical weight, a cold draft that had finally found its way under the door. I could hear Rowan's muffled voice from the kitchen, probably talking to himself, or nursing that cold cup of coffee, completely unaware that the woman he loved was a phantom. Michelle's voice crackled through the burner phone, detailing the real Delilah Mercer's 2014 car accident in Sudbury. It had been a messy affair, a late-night slide off a bridge that the local authorities never quite put to rest. If Delilah is a ghost, then who is the woman holding my granddaughter? I asked, my voice a jagged whisper. "She's a ghostwriter," Calder Michelle replied, the sound of digital rustling following her words. "Someone who rewrites lives for a living. This isn't just identity theft. It's a total immersion." The nausea I felt was visceral, a slow churning in my gut as I realized that every intimate moment, every shared plan, and every memory my son possessed was built on a foundation of skeletal remains and professional forgery. My mind flickered to the entry twist. The Sudbury crash report had holes large enough to drive a truck through. There were no witnesses, and the body had been burned beyond easy recognition. It occurred to me, with a surge of professional coldness, that the imposter didn't just steal a name, she might have cleared the path for the theft herself. How do you tell a man that the woman who sleeps beside him every night is a shadow wearing the skin of a dead girl? I watched dust motes dancing in the singular shaft of light, piercing the dim study, feeling the isolation of the truth. Michelle shifted gears, her tone sharpening as she pulled up the Eugene Martinez file. Eugene was a 71-year-old decorated veteran, a man of discipline and habit, who had been systematically groomed by a boutique wealth management firm where the imposter once worked. She had been his light, his emotional support after his wife passed. And then with surgical precision, she had presented the limited window for a life-changing investment. Eugene didn't lose his $95,000 to a bad market, Michelle said. He lost it to a consultant who remembered his birthday. It's a grooming cycle, Calder. She doesn't ask for the money until she's the only person the victim trusts. My protective fury began to refine itself into analytical clarity. Pattern recognition is a blessing until it starts showing you the shape of your own family's executioner. I could smell the stale coffee on my desk, a bitter reminder of the long night behind me. Then came the second twist. Michelle went silent for a moment, the sound of her rhythmic typing, the only thing filling the space between us. I found a secondary contact in the Martinez file, she said, her voice dropping. A lawyer named Griffin Holt, who facilitated the final wire transfer. The name hit me like a second bullet. The ring was a machine, and Delilah was just the most visible gear. Michelle let out a sharp breath. On the other end, Calder. I just pulled the witness statements from the Martinez case. Eugene isn't the only one she hit. There's a list of sons of wealthy retirees that the firm was tracking. Ann Rowan was next on the board. The realization that my son had become nothing more than the next entry on a predator's checklist filled me with a cold, disciplined fury. I sat at my desk watching the digital clock shift to 6 p.m., the red numbers glowing against the dark mahogany surface like a countdown bleeding slowly toward zero. Instinct alone was no longer enough. I needed proof, something clinical and irrefutable. So I called Stephen Gallagher. Stephen had spent 2 decades as a forensic accountant working complex financial cases for the Crown. He was the kind of man who could locate a missing penny buried inside mountains of corporate filings and offshore transfers. If anyone could dissect the Cascade Fund documents with surgical precision, it was him. An hour earlier, I had sent him every encrypted file I possessed. The moment he answered, the tone of his voice told me the truth was already worse than I expected. "Calder," he said through the faint static of the line, "this isn't an investment document. It's a suicide note for a bank account." I leaned back slowly in my chair. Stephen continued explaining what he had found. The Cascade Fund, he said, was built on what forensic accountants refer to as empty language contracts designed to look dense and authoritative while actually committing to nothing. The subscription agreement is basically a frame without a painting, he said. All structure, no substance. On paper, the document looked thorough, but the schedule detailing physical assets, the section that should have listed actual holdings, had been deliberately left blank. That blank space wasn't an oversight. It created legal limbo. Any funds transferred into the structure would technically exist inside the agreement without being tied to a defined asset. In other words, the money could disappear without leaving a trace. That's not the worst part, Stephen added. He explained that the Cascade Private Capital Fund wasn't even an original name. It was a mirror. A legitimate investment fund in the Midwest operated under an almost identical name and had produced years of strong returns. Anyone performing a quick online search would find glowing articles, financial reviews, and industry praise. But the routing number on Rowan's documents led somewhere else entirely. A digital void. Anyone verifying the name would think they were investing in the real fund, Stephen said. But the transfer instructions send the money somewhere completely different. I tightened my grip on the phone. "How long do we have?" I asked quietly. "Give it to me in hours, not days." There was a brief pause before he answered. 72 hours. The number landed heavily in the room. That's all it takes to turn a man's life savings into a string of zeros on a Cayman Islands server. Stephen called it the laundry cycle. Once the wire transfer reached the primary intake account, in this case, a credit union in British Columbia, the funds entered a financial half-life that lasted roughly 3 days. During that time, the money would be split into smaller fragments, layered through shell companies, pushed across international accounts. By the time investigators followed the trail, the funds would have dissolved completely into offshore holding networks. After that, Stephen said quietly, "It's gone." I glanced again at the clock on my desk. With Delilah pushing for a transfer before the end of the month, we were no longer simply investigating a crime. We were standing inside the final 48 hours of her grooming phase. She wasn't just trying to move money, she was preparing to erase it. People think robbery involves noise guns, alarms, broken glass. But the most dangerous weapon a thief can carry is a wire transfer confirmation. It makes no sound. It happens instantly. And once it's done, there's almost no way to undo it. The room suddenly felt smaller. The scent of old mahogany and paper pressed down on me like a physical weight while I began calculating possible ways to freeze the transaction before it moved beyond reach. Then Stephen spoke again. "Calder, there's something else." My attention sharpened immediately. I traced the email metadata from the prospectus Rowan gave you, and it wasn't sent from a corporate office. The pause that followed stretched uncomfortably long. It came from an IP address inside your own house. My chest tightened. "What time?" I asked. 3:15 a.m. yesterday morning. A wave of cold realization moved through me. Delilah had been sitting inside my guest room, using my own Wi-Fi network to send the documents designed to destroy my son's future. I had been asleep less than 20 feet away. The betrayal suddenly felt larger than financial fraud. It was territorial. The hunter wasn't outside the camp anymore. She was already inside, sharpening her knives beside my fire. At that moment, the study door creaked open. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. I looked up. Rowan stood in the doorway, pale and trembling, the whites of his eyes stark against his exhausted face. One glance told me everything. The pressure had finally reached its breaking point. "Dad," he whispered. His voice shook so badly the word barely crossed the room. "Delilah just asked for my login." I felt my pulse quicken. "She says the window's closing tonight," he continued, swallowing hard. "She says, if I don't move the money now," his voice faltered, "we lose everything." The harsh scrape of my chair across the hardwood floor was the only warning before I lunged forward to catch my son. Rowan looked like a man about to collapse inward, his knees threatening to buckle beneath the crushing pressure of the demand Delilah had just placed on him. There was no time for hesitation, no space for fear to settle in his mind. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and pushed him toward the front door before he could even form another sentence. Within minutes, we were in my car, the engine roaring to life as I steered us toward his apartment. My hands gripped the wheel with the sharp, focused tension I remembered from years behind the wheel of a patrol car, responding to a 1033 officer in need of assistance. The gray Portland morning streamed past us in streaks of rain and steel-colored clouds, but my thoughts had already moved ahead of the car. I was picturing his apartment, every corner of it, already searching for whatever trap Delilah might have left behind. When we stepped inside his living room, the smell struck me immediately. Stale air mixed with damp fabric and unwashed laundry, the scent of a space that had been lived in under pressure rather than comfort. My eyes instinctively began sweeping the room. Old habits never fade. I checked corners, shelves, and reflections in dark glass, watching for the faint glimmer of a hidden camera lens or the unnatural placement of a recording device. Delilah had not wasted her time. The entire apartment had been quietly transformed into something resembling a stage set, designed to manufacture urgency. Glossy financial magazines, most of them counterfeit at a glance, were neatly fanned across the coffee table as though they had been studied repeatedly. In the far corner stood an easel board, covered in charts, rising lines, and projected returns that all pointed upward in triumphant green arrows. It was a theater of opportunity. But more than that, it was a theater of pressure. I guided Rowan toward the sofa and pushed him down onto it. His phone vibrated again in his hand, lighting up with yet another incoming message. "Put the phone down," Rowan, I said, sharply. My voice carried the flat, controlled tone of a lead investigator managing a volatile witness. "You're not an architect right now. You're a witness." He stared at me clearly, struggling to steady himself. His hands shook so violently that he finally pressed them beneath his thighs in an attempt to hide the tremor. "She says if I don't do it now, we lose everything," he whispered. His voice sounded thin and fragile. "The house, Ria's school fund, all of it." I lowered myself down in front of him so that he had no choice but to meet my eyes. I already knew this wasn't just about money. Predators never rely on a single hook. "There's something else, Rowan," I said quietly. "Tell me." The resistance inside him finally broke. His shoulders sagged as the truth surfaced. Delilah had discovered the records from the worst chapter of his past, a hit-and-run DUI from years ago when he was younger and reckless. But she hadn't simply stumbled onto those records. She had hunted them down. Shame is a predator's favorite weapon. It waits patiently until a person is exhausted, then sinks its teeth into the softest part of their history and refuses to let go. She said, "If I don't sign the transfer," Rowan admitted, "she'll send the dash cam footage to my firm and to child services." His eyes dropped to the floor. "They'll pull my license. I'll lose my job, and they'll question my custody of Rhea." A cold anger began climbing steadily through my chest. The cruelty of the plan revealed itself piece by piece. Delilah had not simply uncovered the old arrest report. She had paid Griffin Holt to track down the officer who made the original stop and bribe him for access to the unedited footage. That level of preparation wasn't improvisation. It was engineering. "She didn't discover those records," I said slowly, my voice hardening into iron. "She built a cage for you." Rowan looked up at me helplessly. "She fed your shame just enough to keep you on a leash." The woman he had fallen in love with had not built a life with him. She had constructed a prison around him, one with walls so transparent he never realized he was trapped. Rowan's eyes drifted toward the wall clock above the television. The steady ticking sounded unnaturally loud in the silent room, each second striking like a hammer against metal. "He'll be here at noon," Rowan said quietly. My stomach tightened. "Who will the notary?" he replied. He swallowed before continuing. "Delilah arranged for him to come finalize the liquidation papers. She said he's a family friend who handles all of her sensitive legal work." The room felt suddenly colder. She called him Griffin. For a moment, I said nothing. The name alone was enough. A wave of icy realization moved through my veins. Griffin Holt was no longer operating from the shadows. He wasn't sending instructions through layers of intermediaries. The kingpin himself was coming to the front door. The realization that Griffin Holt was walking toward my son's front door turned the drive home into a blur of cold-focused adrenaline. If they were hitting Rowan this hard, applying pressure to every fracture in his history, then my own house was likely already compromised. I returned home late Tuesday night, the Portland rain slicking the driveway into a dark mirror. I had left Rowan under Alara's watchful eye, at a secure location, a friend's cabin, where the perimeter was clear and the phone lines were dead. Stepping into my own study, the air felt heavy as if the room itself was holding its breath, while I reached for the hidden keypad behind the first edition Hemingway. The smell of gun oil and old books usually brought me a sense of order, but tonight it felt like the scent of a tomb. I punched in the code, the safe's electronic beep sounding like a gunshot in the midnight silence. I opened the floor safe, initially relieved, to see my collection of gold eagles and Morgan silver dollars seemingly intact. I began a methodical inspection, driven by the professional paranoia that Delilah's access to this house was never just about babysitting Rhea or playing the part of the doting daughter-in-law. I pulled out a 1907 St. Gaudens double eagle, the crown jewel of my retirement hedge, and felt a sudden sickening lightness in my palm. My stomach dropped. I checked the digital log on the safe's interior panel, and my blood turned to ice. The safe had been accessed 3 months ago using Alara's biometric bypass. It was impossible. Alara never came in here alone, and she certainly never touched the coins. I realized with a jolt of horror that Delilah must have recorded Alara's fingerprint while she was sleeping, or perhaps lightly drugged during one of those spa nights Delilah was always arranging. A man's home is his castle until he realizes the queen has been selling the bricks from the inside out. My sanctuary had been turned into a showroom for a thief who didn't even need a crowbar. I moved to my workbench, clicking on the overhead lamp. I used a precision scale and a digital caliper to test the St. Gaudens, the digital scale's high-pitched tinkle echoing off the mahogany walls. The weight was off by exactly 0.4 grams. I adjusted my jeweler's loop, my eyes stinging as I searched the rim of the coin. There they were, the microscopic tooling marks, the same ghost signature I had found on the Cascade Fund documents. It was a high-lead core Chinese counterfeit, a perfect visual replica that held absolutely no value. I went through the rest of the tray, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure clinical rage. Over 40% of my collection had been systematically swapped for worthless metal slugs. Metal. "It's just painted lead," I whispered to the empty room. "She's been walking through my house and stealing my past while I was making her tea." How many times had I sat in this very chair? bragging to her about the rarity of a coin that was already sitting in her purse. My hands were trembling as I reached for the felt-lined case of a fake Morgan dollar. As I tilted the case, a small black object tumbled out. It was a GPS tracker, no larger than a button hidden inside the hollowed-out center of the counterfeit case. I stared at the tracker's blinking red light and realized Delilah wasn't just a thief. She was a jailer, and I had just walked right back into the center of her web. The phone in my pocket buzzed the vibration, feeling like an electric shock against my leg, but I didn't answer it. My eyes were fixed on the tracker's blinking red light, a silent confirmation that the woman my son loved had turned our lives into a controlled experiment. I spent the rest of the night in a state of icy clinical rage, calculating every move she had made, while I was playing the part of the doting grandfather. By Wednesday morning, the rain had settled into a gray, insistent drizzle. I stood in the bank's sterile lobby, watching my son's hands shake as he handed his ID to the teller, a man about to realize that the vault protecting his family's history had been hollowed out from the inside. Rowan moved with the lethargy of a man who had already accepted the worst, but the reality was far more surgical than he imagined. We were led back to a windowless viewing room that smelled of ozone and old paper, the heavy vault door swinging shut behind us with a finality that made the air feel thin. When the teller pulled the long metal deposit box, I saw Rowan's shoulder drop. He didn't even have to open it. He knew by the way the metal slid across the table. It was too light. Inside, there were no emeralds, no graduation Omega watch, and no heirloom gold. There was only a single folded receipt for a jewelry cleaning service that didn't exist. "It's gone," Rowan whispered, his voice echoing in the small, sterile room. "Dad, she told me she put it in here for safekeeping after the move." I felt the cold metal of the table under my palms. "Check the access logs." "Rowan," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. Every time a shadow moves, it leaves a signature. We were moved to the bank manager's office, where the rhythmic typing of the keyboard felt like a countdown. The manager revealed that Delilah had accessed the box 8 months ago, signing as Delilah Mercer Whitlock. But that wasn't the end of it. The manager looked at us with a pained expression, revealing that she had used the jewelry as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan in Rowan's name, a loan that was now 3 months overdue. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone you loved and realized they were just a mirror reflecting the person they wanted you to be while they picked your pockets? Rowan sat there, a hollowed-out version of the man I had raised. He began a mental inventory of their apartment, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The golf clubs he thought he'd left at the club, the vinyl collection he thought was in storage, even his backup laptop, they weren't lost. They were liquidated. He recalled Delilah's comforting voice, the way she'd sigh and tell him he was getting forgetful because he was too stressed at work. "That's the hallmark of a professional son," I said, my heart breaking for him. "They don't just steal your things, they steal your confidence so you won't look for them." The ink on the final document the manager handed us was blue, simple and final. It was a pawn slip Rowan found tucked in the corner of the empty box for his grandmother's wedding ring. It was dated the very morning of their first wedding anniversary. Rowan dropped the slip, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. "She didn't just take the money, Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "She took my mother's memory and sold it for $40 a month." The drive from the bank to the state police HQ was the longest 10 miles of my life, the silence in the car vibrating with Rowan's raw, wounded fury. I didn't use the visitor's entrance. I swiped my retired officer's badge at the side gate, the heavy magnetic lock clicking open like the jaws of a trap finally being set. The smell of institutional floor wax hit me as we moved through the corridors, a scent that usually meant order, but today smelled like a crime scene stretching back years. Michelle Torres was waiting in a secure briefing room, her face lit by the cold blue glow of a digital map, displaying a multi-state fraud ring. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They don't want the 401k Rowan," she said, her voice dropping as she pulled up a series of decrypted emails. "That's just the appetizer. They're after the main course." The map showed 12 families targeted across 5 states, all following the same predatory cycle. Then she dropped the first hammer. Delilah had already applied for a life insurance policy on Rowan, including a double indemnity clause for accidental death. My son's face went pasty, his eyes fixed on the screen as the implication of a permanent exit strategy settled into the room. "Look at the timestamp on this email." Michelle continued, pointing to a message from Griffin Holt. "She was planning your chance meeting at the gym 6 months before it actually happened. How many accidental tragedies are actually just the final line of a well-written script?" I felt the cold laminate of the briefing table under my palms as I read the specific directives Delilah had received. This wasn't just about Rowan's savings. It was a long-game infiltration. The goal was my probate information, my private security codes, and the total liquidation of the Whitlock estate, all 2.8 million of it. Every family holiday, every Sunday, roast every single time I let her hold my granddaughter while I made tea, was nothing more than a reconnaissance mission. She wasn't just marrying into this family, she was being deployed into it to map my safe and my digital footprint, the gym membership, the random coffee spill, the wedding vows. All of it was a ledger entry. I felt a deep structural betrayal that went beyond money. It was the violation of my sanctuary, the weaponization of my son's need for love against the very person he should have been able to trust most. Pattern recognition is a cop's greatest tool, but seeing it applied to my own family felt like a slow-motion execution. Michelle tapped a final key, bringing up a grainy surveillance photo from a park. It showed Delilah meeting with a man whose face made my pulse hammer against my ribs. It was the same officer who had arrested Rowan for his DUI years ago. The realization hit me with a sickening thud. The arrest hadn't been a piece of bad luck, she discovered. It was a staged event to create the shame they needed to control him. My hands gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned in the quiet room. She didn't just find his past. Michelle, I whispered, my voice thick with a lethal clinical rage. She manufactured his downfall to make herself the only person he could trust. We weren't looking at a wife anymore. We were looking at a saboteur who had been living in our guest room. The walk from the state police headquarters back to the parking garage felt like crossing a field I finally understood was filled with mines. Every echo of footsteps in the concrete corridors sounded sharper than usual. Every shadow seemed to carry the weight of something hidden. But now at least I had the map. The cold focus in my veins made the steering wheel feel less like a tool and more like an extension of my own bones. Most people believe history simply happens to them, unfolding one moment after another without design. Yet, when I returned home and sat before the pale blue glow of my computer screen, I realized something unsettling. My son's life hadn't been unfolding naturally at all. It had been written like a script, one that a stranger began drafting 3 years before Rowan even met her. The only sound in the study was the low hum of the computer fan and the steady click of my mouse. Stephen Gallagher had just sent over an encrypted data package he'd managed to reconstruct. What I was looking at wasn't just a collection of files. It was a digital autopsy of Delilah's past. Stephen had managed to recover fragments of search history from a laptop she believed she had wiped clean back in 2021. The log entries moved chronologically across the screen as I scrolled. At first they looked ordinary. Travel searches, fitness programs, financial articles. But then my breath caught in my throat. My own name appeared in the search records. Calder Whitlock. The next line read, Oregon State Police retirement date. Then another estimated pension value. I leaned closer to the monitor, feeling a slow chill climb up my spine. Months before Delilah ever introduced herself to my son, she had already searched my financial worth and consulted actuarial tables estimating my lifespan. Rowan had never been the true target. He was simply the most convenient doorway into the estate I had spent 30 years building. The realization twisted in my stomach with a kind of clinical horror. The files showed something else as well. There was a second list. This one named my wife, Ilara Whitlock. Delilah had compiled notes outlining possible ways to create friction between us. The plan was simple. If gaining control through Rowan didn't grant her access to my assets, she intended to isolate me from my own family. I leaned back in my chair, the bitter scent of old coffee lingering in the room. She didn't fall for his smile, Stephen, I murmured quietly. She fell for my actuarial tables. How do you explain to a father that what appeared to be the happiest coincidence of his son's life was actually a carefully engineered trap that the woman who claimed to fall in love with him had already spent hundreds of hours studying his routines before saying hello? The recovered data made it painfully clear. Delilah had joined Rowan's gym exactly 2 weeks before the day they first met at the juice bar. She had created automated alerts for his social media posts and tracked his daily jogging routes through a fitness application until she knew his running pace better than he did. Even their first conversation had been calculated. The protein shake she spilled on the floor that day, the moment Rowan always described as a clumsy, charming accident, had been timed deliberately. It wasn't an accident. It was a tactical insertion. 4 months of surveillance and preparation just to engineer a chance encounter. That isn't romance. That's a siege. The date on the earliest search entry was October 14th, 11 months before their wedding. The hunt had begun long before the prey ever knew the season was open. My anger didn't explode outward. Instead, it sharpened inward, focusing into something colder and far more controlled. My fingertips rested calmly against the polished surface of my desk, but inside my mind, a single thought burned. Someone had invaded my family. Then I opened the final recovered folder, images. They had been pulled from a deleted cloud archive. The first photograph made the hair rise on the back of my neck. Delilah stood on the sidewalk outside my own house. The timestamp showed it had been taken a full year before she married my son. She held a folded floor plan of the neighborhood. In one hand, her gaze fixed directly on my front door with the patient intensity of a predator studying its prey. I enlarged the image slowly. That was when my pulse began hammering. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood a man whose face had been blurred by motion as the photo was taken. But one detail remained perfectly clear: the heavy gold signet ring on his hand. I had seen that ring before. Years earlier, during a tense deposition tied to the Ponzi investigation, Griffin Holt had worn the same distinctive band. The ghost I thought had vanished from that case wasn't hiding inside digital records. He had been standing on the curb outside my house. The walk from my study to the kitchen felt like moving through a house that was no longer mine, but a crime scene I hadn't finished processing. I sat in the parking lot across from the coffee shop, the headset in my ear crackling with the ambient noise of a crowded cafe and the heavy rhythmic thumping of my son's heart. Through the window of Stumptown Coffee, I watched Rowan approach the corner table, where Delilah sat, her posture as poised and predatory as a hawk. The smell of roasted beans and wet raincoats seemed to drift through the receiver, or perhaps my mind was simply filling in the gaps of the institutional gray afternoon. Rowan took a seat, his phone recording every vibration from his front shirt pocket. I listened as he began his performance, his voice pitched in that specific submissive tone of an apologetic husband. "I'm sorry for the hesitation, Delilah," he said, and I could hear his shallow, controlled breathing. "I just wanted to make sure we were doing what's best for Rhea." Delilah didn't miss a beat. Her manicured nails tapped the table with a sharp, rhythmic click that sounded like a ticking clock. "It's okay, honey," she replied, her voice smooth as silk. "High net worth moves like this are always a bit scary the first time." Sensing the imminent payday, she dropped her guard, detailing the Cascade private capital structure with a terrifying, predatory grace. She leaned in closer, whispering that the notary who would sign the final documents was a close family friend named Griffin. The name sent a jolt of ice through my chest. It confirmed the ring's local presence and the absolute lack of independent oversight. Hearing her voice through the receiver was like listening to a siren, beautiful, melodic, and designed to lead a man straight onto the rocks. She was good. She was the kind of professional who could sell a drowning man a lead vest and make him thank her for the wait. Delilah then provided the exact wire transfer details for a credit union in British Columbia, her voice steady as she explained they avoided big banks for processing speed. She confirmed the 18 to 22% annual returns on audio, explicitly telling Rowan that the intake window would slam shut in less than 24 hours. I noted every admission, every fraudulent solicitation, and every unregistered security claim, as if I were back on active duty building a case for a prosecutor I hadn't met yet. "The money will be working for us within 72 hours of the transfer hitting this account," she promised. 72 hours, Rowan repeated, and I could hear the grit in his voice. "And then it grows 3 times faster than a standard 401k. How many times had she sat across from a victim and watched the hope in their eyes while she planned their bankruptcy? As Rowan stood to leave, Delilah's voice took on a playful, chilling edge. She mentioned she'd already packed a bag for a surprise celebration trip to Vancouver. The satisfaction of the trap being set was instantly replaced by a cold, hard urgency. She wasn't just planning a vacation, she was ready to flee the moment the wire cleared. Rowan walked out into the rain, his face deathly still, as he passed my car without a glance. He reached the sidewalk and whispered into the hidden mic, the sound of an espresso machine hissing in the background of the recording, finally cutting out, "She's ready, Dad. She's already got the passports in her purse." The drive back to my house was a hollow exercise in restraint. Beside me, the recording hidden in Rowan's pocket felt like a live wire, humming with every detail of Delilah's carefully planned escape. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel, but my mind had already moved beyond the wire transfer she was pushing. For weeks, a darker possibility had been flickering at the edge of my instincts, something I hadn't wanted to name. There is a certain kind of cold that settles in a detective's gut when he realizes the family tree he's spent years nurturing might be nothing more than plastic branches and carefully arranged lies. When we stepped through the front door, the house greeted us with the soft scent of lavender baby lotion. Under normal circumstances, it would have been comforting. Now it felt like perfume sprayed across a crime scene. Rhea, my 2-year-old granddaughter, sat on the living room rug, surrounded by wooden blocks. Her curls bounced as she laughed quietly to herself, stacking and knocking down towers that clattered against the hardwood floor. She had no idea she was the center of a battle measured not in emotions but in millions of dollars. I lowered myself into my armchair and watched her with a detached focus I normally reserve for witness interviews. Memories began lining up in my head like pieces of evidence. The emergency birth in a small hospital 3 hours away, the chaotic night, and Delilah's stubborn refusal to provide the Whitlock family's medical history when the nurses requested it for the records. She had brushed it off as a privacy concern. At the time it seemed odd but harmless. Now it felt deliberate. I studied Rhea again. Our family had carried certain traits through 4 generations: height, eye color, even the shape of the earlobes. Rhea possessed none of them. "She's getting tall, Delilah," I said, casually forcing my voice to remain steady, "though she doesn't seem to have the typical Whitlock height." Delilah barely glanced up from her phone. Her manicured fingers moved rapidly across the screen. "Genetics are a roll of the dice," Calder, she replied dismissively. "You know that." She stood and reached into her diaper bag to retrieve a rattle. As the bag opened, a corner of folded paperwork became visible. My chest tightened instantly. Canadian travel consent forms. They were already filled out. Worse still, Rowan's signature had been forged across the authorization lines. How far would someone go to protect their leverage? Would a predator steal a child's identity if it guaranteed control of the ransom? I had seen men murdered for a few $100s. For $2.8 million, a bloodline could become nothing more than an entry on a ledger. A moment later, Delilah's phone rang. She walked into the kitchen to answer it. The second she disappeared from view, I moved. My hands that had remained steady through decades of investigations reached for the pacifier Rhea had dropped beside the coffee table. It was still warm, a small piece of plastic that might hold the truth about my son's entire future. Using a sterile cloth from my study, I sealed it carefully inside a clean evidence bag. The movement came automatically guided by years of practice. Rhea looked up at me with wide eyes that seemed slightly unfocused. Only then did I notice the faint herbal scent on her breath. A sedative. That explained the unusual lethargy Rowan had mentioned recently. Delilah wasn't just preparing to leave, she was making sure the cargo stayed quiet. I retreated to my study and locked the door. Within seconds I was logged into a secure laboratory portal I had used during my consulting years. I initiated a 72-hour expedited paternity comparison using the DNA sample Rowan had provided during his last medical exam. My finger hovered briefly above the screen before I clicked confirm. The countdown timer appeared immediately. 72 hours. 72 hours until I discovered whether the little girl playing on my living room floor was truly a Whitlock at all. The 72 hours felt like a lifetime, each second ticking by with the weight of a gavel striking the surface of my soul. I sat in my study, the smell of old paper and stale anxiety hanging in the air like a fog I couldn't navigate. My eyes were fixed on the monitor, my hands cold as I watched the refresh icon spin on my laptop screen, a small, that silver circle that held the power to delete 2 years of my son's life with a single percentage point. When the encrypted file finally bloomed into clarity, the world seemed to stop spinning. The lab results were stark clinical and absolute a 0% probability of paternity. Rowan was not Rhea's father. I felt a sickening weight settle in my chest, the kind of heavy airless pressure I'd only felt at the most grisly crime scenes. 0. It was a clean break, a total fabrication. She didn't just steal his money, she stole his bloodline. As I dug deeper into the technical breakdown of the alleles, a darker suspicion began to take shape. I cross-referenced the markers with the data Michelle had provided on the ring's known associates. My pulse hammered as I found a partial match between Rhea and the forger's lineage. It was a factory setting. The ring wasn't just stealing lives, they were literally breeding the leverage they needed to hollow out men like my son. A paternity test doesn't measure love. It just measures the distance between two people's cells. But in a court of law, that distance is an ocean. I heard the ticking clock on the mantel sounding like a countdown to an execution. I called Rowan into the study. He walked in with a hopeful, questioning look that I had to extinguish with a single glance. I showed him the monitor. He didn't scream or rage. He simply collapsed into the cold leather chair, his ragged breathing the only sound in the room. The silence was heavy with the sound of a man's heart breaking into jagged pieces. "She's not mine, Dad," he whispered, his eyes red and unfocused. All this time, I was just a placeholder. I watched him struggle with the existential gravity of the lie. The realization that every midnight feeding and every first step had been part of a long-game performance. If a man builds a house on a foundation of sand but fills it with a lifetime of warmth, is the home any less real when the tide comes in? Rowan answered that question himself. He looked up, his face hardening into a fierce, defiant mask I hadn't seen since he was a boy defending a friend on the playground. "It doesn't change a thing," he said, his voice regaining its steel. "I'm the one who held her when she had the fever. I'm her father, period." He then revealed a detail that made my professional blood run cold. Delilah had claimed a medical emergency shortly after the birth that prevented any further children. It was a move to ensure Rhea remained the sole undisputed heir to my estate. The premeditation was a suffocating shroud. Rowan stood up, wiping his eyes with a shaking hand, his resolve as sharp as a razor. If she thinks she can use a lab report to take my daughter to Canada, she's forgotten whose son I am. The drive to the federal building was the longest silence we'd ever shared, the DNA report sitting between us on the console like an unexploded bomb. I watched my son out of the corner of my eye, seeing the way he gripped the door handle until his knuckles were ivory white. He didn't look shattered anymore. He looked forged. The steel doors of the federal building closed behind us with a pneumatic hiss that sounded exactly like a prison gate, only this time I was the one making sure the right person ended up on the inside. We were led deep into the interior, through corridors that smelled of institutional coffee and nerves, until we reached a secure war room. Michelle Torres was already there, standing beside Agent Vance. Agent Vance was a tall, lean man, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many life savings vanish into thin air, and he looked at my son like a piece of evidence he couldn't afford to break. The room was dominated by digital maps on the wall, glowing with the heat signatures of a multi-state investigation. "We've been chasing this cell for 18 months, Vance said, his voice as dry as parchment. "Your son just handed us the keys to their kingdom." He played the audio recording from Stumptown Coffee, the sound of audio feedback making me wince, but the words were clear enough to hang a dozen men. Delilah's voice detailing the wire fraud was the smoking gun they needed. However, Vance's expression remained grim. He revealed that, while they had flagged Delilah's passport at the Canadian border, they were legally hamstrung until she either attempted to cross or signed the final fraudulent documents scheduled for the morning. How do you breathe normally when you know the woman sleeping 3 feet away is a viper waiting for the sun to rise? That was the question hanging in the air as Vance outlined the tactical plan. It was a 3-pronged raid scheduled for 8 a.m., Friday Rowan's apartment, Griffin Holt's legal office in Seattle, and the residence of their primary forger. "Rowan, you have to go back," Vance said, leaning over the cold metal table. "You have to be the man she thinks she's already broken. One more night of normal." I felt a surge of protective fury, but I knew the man was right. In a tactical operation, the silence is never empty. It's filled with the variables you haven't accounted for yet. If she smells the FB's eye, she won't go to the bank. She'll go for the border, and she'll take the girl with her. The pressure of the 72-hour window was crushing now, a physical weight on my shoulders. Then Michelle tapped a key, and a new flight manifest appeared on the screen. She unmasked a private charter flight, booked for 11 a.m. Friday from a small private airfield. It was paid for in cash by a Diana Voss. "That's her," I whispered. "She's not waiting for the bank transfer to clear. She's leaving as soon as the signature is on the paper." The arrest window wasn't just tight, it was a needle's eye. Vance looked Rowan dead in the eye, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "If she takes that child and reaches that airfield before we breach, she's gone. You cannot fail tonight." The walk back to the parking garage felt like stepping into the cold air before a dive. I had spent my career learning that the most dangerous moment isn't when you're in the dark. It's when you finally think you've seen everything and you let your guard down for one heartbeat. By the time I arrived home at 6 o'clock, a deceptive sense of control had settled over me. I retreated to my study, the blue light of the monitor illuminating the final investigative logs I was syncing with the FBI's cloud server. My hands were steady, my mind already cataloging the victory. Ilara and I shared a tense dinner, the clinking of silverware against china, the only rhythm to our hushed conversation about the psychological parent doctrine we would need to secure Ria's future. "Tomorrow morning, Ilara," I said, leaning back with a sigh that felt far too much like relief. "By 8:05, this is over. Vance is ready. The trap is set." Ilara looked at me, her eyes clouded with a wisdom I should have heeded. Don't underestimate her caldor. A cornered animal doesn't just run, it bites. I brushed it off, confident in the digital trail I had helped blaze. I didn't notice the static on my burner phone until it was too late. As I reviewed the logs, I saw an entry twist I hadn't prepared for, a series of doctored text messages originating from my own encrypted line messages that painted a picture of a man unhinged, threatening violence against my daughter-in-law. She hadn't just been watching, she had cloned my burner. The paper felt heavier than a lead coin. It was a court-ordered blindfold. The chime of the doorbell at 6:30 didn't sound like a delivery. It sounded like a funeral bell. I opened the door to find a process server, a weary-looking man in a wrinkled polo shirt, a low-level cog in a legal machine that Delilah had just hijacked. He didn't look me in the eye as he thrust a stack of cold, crisp legal papers into my hand. "You've been served, Mr. Whitlock," he muttered. "You need to step back from the door." I looked down at the temporary restraining order, the words harassment, erratic behavior, and threats of violence, jumping off the page in stark black ink. It was an absolute prohibition, 500 feet from Delilah and Ria, and zero contact with Rowan. "She's isolating them?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "This isn't a legal move, it's a tactical wall. How do you protect your family when the law itself has been turned into a weapon for the thief?" I felt Ilara's presence behind me, her face draining of color as she read the top page. The car engine of the process server idled in the rain-dampened driveway, the smell of exhaust and wet pavement filling my lungs. I flipped to the witness statement at the back, expecting a fabrication from a stranger. Instead, I found a betrayal that reached into the marrow of my bones. The statement confirming my unstable history was signed by a familiar name. I looked at the signature on the witness statement and felt my stomach drop. It wasn't just a former cop. It was my own brother Vernon, who had been groomed and used to bury me. The conspiracy hadn't just reached the precinct. It had reached my dinner table years ago, and now the gate was locked from the outside. The darkness of Friday morning at 6 a.m. felt like a shroud, and my phone was a dead weight I wasn't allowed to touch. That legal paper in my study, signed by my own brother, had effectively severed my connection to the people I needed to protect most. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, a prisoner of a temporary restraining order, while across town, the trap Delilah had built was snapping shut. I could almost hear the gears grinding. The sun hadn't even cleared the Cascades when Delilah dropped a manila envelope onto the breakfast table in Rowan's apartment. Not with the gentleness of a wife, but with the heavy, final thud of a guillotine blade. Rowan told me later that the sound seemed to echo through the entire flat. She didn't offer him coffee, she offered him an ultimatum. Inside that envelope was a copy of the DNA results I had spent 72 hours sweating over. She'd intercepted them, or perhaps she'd had a duplicate set all along. "You're not her father, Rowan," she said, her voice a flat line. "You're just a roommate who's been paying the bills." She laid out the final wire transfer authorization for the $420,000, her triumphant smile glinting in the dim light of the kitchen. If he didn't sign it by noon, she was filing for emergency sole custody using the DNA to prove he had no rights before vanishing to Canada. She'd already filed a petition using the doctored evidence she'd used against me, painting the whole Whitlock family as a nest of dangerous lunatics. How do you look into the eyes of the woman who shared your bed and see only the cold, calculating hunger of a wolf? My son sat there feeling the walls of his life closing in. But he remembered my training. He fought back the urge to scream, to reach across the table and demand his life back. Instead, he forced his breathing to slow. He played the part of the broken, defeated man she expected him to be. "Fine," he told her, his voice trembling with a well-earned desperation. "You win, just don't take her. I'll sign it, but I have to do it at the bank branch at 9 to make sure the flags don't trigger an automatic freeze." The coffee in his mug was cold. The air in the room was colder. Delilah leaned back, watching him with the satisfaction of a predator that had finally worn its prey down. "Good boy," she purred. "I knew you'd see reason when the stakes were high enough." Rowan Stalling bought the FBI 2 critical hours, a thin margin of safety in a game that was rapidly running out of time. While she was distracted by her victory, he managed to trigger the SOS signal we'd set up on the smart thermostat, a simple temperature spike that would alert the task force. But as he stood up to clear the table, he saw it. a small flesh-colored bud in her ear glinting as the morning light caught the plastic. She wasn't just acting on her own, she was being coached in real time. Griffin Holt was in her ear directing the kill from a nearby vantage point. Delilah tapped her earpiece and smiled a look of pure triumph that made Rowan's skin crawl. "Griffin says the notary is 10 minutes away," she said. "We don't need the bank, Rowan. We're doing this here." I watched the grain of the video feed from the smart doorbell vibrate as heavy silent boots moved into the stairwell. The federal hammer was finally in the air, and Delilah had no idea the ceiling was about to collapse. I was legally barred from being within 500 feet of that apartment, but Michelle had opened a digital window for me, a secure link that let me monitor the silent swarm of tactical teams saturating the complex. On my monitor, heat signatures moved like ghosts through the rain-drenched shadows of the hallway. Inside the apartment, Rowan was a statue of forced calm, distractedly bouncing Rhea on his knee, while a cartoon jingle played with mocking cheerfulness in the background. Delilah paced the length of the living room, like a hungry cat, her manicured fingers twitching, every time she glanced at the window. "He's just pulling in now, Rowan," she said, her voice tight with a predatory greed she could no longer hide. "Get the pen ready. I need to change her diaper first." Delilah. Rowan countered, his voice steady, even as 82 heartbeats per minute thudded against his chest. "Just give me a second." I saw the entry twist clearly on the high-definition perimeter. Cam, the notary arriving in the black sedan, wasn't a civil servant. He was a man built like a fire hydrant, wearing a suit 2 sizes too small and carrying a briefcase that likely held more lead than paper. As he stepped out, the jacket pulled tight, revealing the unmistakable print of a concealed weapon. The celebration trip to Vancouver was never meant to have a return flight for my son. Before I reveal what was actually inside that briefcase, let me ask, are you still with me? Comment one word describing how you feel right now. I'd love to see your reactions. Quick note, some details ahead are recreated for storytelling purposes to highlight the message of vigilance. If this isn't your kind of story, feel free to stop here. The notary reached the threshold of the building. In my ear, Michelle's voice was a sharp professional whisper. "Target is at the threshold. All units hold for the primary signature." "Calder, if you're listening, we've got them." The tactical lead signaled breach minus 60 seconds. I adjusted the contrast on my screen, my hands gripping the control joystick until my knuckles were white. How many families had been destroyed by this exact sequence of events before we stepped into the line of fire? I felt a jolt of cold recognition as the camera panned to the street corner. There, parked 2 blocks away with its headlights off, was my brother Vernon's car. He wasn't just a witness, he was the getaway driver, the final piece of a betrayal that made my gorge rise. Tactical agents stacked up against the wall, outside Rowan's door, their weapons at the ready, black-clad shadows against the beige apartment wallpaper. Delilah reached for the deadbolt, a triumphant smile lighting her face as she prepared to welcome the end of our family's history. "Come in," she called out, her voice melodic and deadly. "Let's get this over with." I held my breath, watching the lead agent's arm cock back. The notary's hand reached for the door handle just as the flashbang left the agent's hand. The world was about to turn white. The world didn't simply turn white. It fractured into a storm of light and sound as the front door exploded inward. The blast tore the air from Rowan's lungs, the shockwave rippling through the living room like a physical punch. Through the grainy digital feed Michelle had patched into my monitor, I watched the scene dissolve into dust and blinding flashes of magnesium light. Black-clad agents surged through the doorway with the relentless precision of a rising tide. Their boots thundered across the floorboards Rowan and I had polished together only 6 months earlier. The room that once held birthday parties and quiet evenings became a battlefield in seconds. Delilah never even had time to scream. She was slammed to the carpet, her cheek pressed into the same rug where she had spent months carefully manipulating everyone around her. Across the room, Rowan reacted on instinct alone. He dove toward Rhea, pulling her tiny body against his chest and shielding her as the man posing as a notary was tackled against the breakfast table. The man's briefcase burst open as he fell, forged contracts scattering across the floor like paper confetti at a funeral. "FBI down, hands behind your head." The lead agent shouted, his voice slicing through the chaos. Even through the digital feed, I could see Rowan clutching Rhea, close, his head bent as he whispered something into her curls. I couldn't hear the words, but I felt their meaning in my bones. "I've got you. You're safe." During the struggle, something small bounced across the floor, Delilah's earpiece. It skittered against the baseboard, and in the sudden silence after the breach, a voice crackled faintly through the tiny speaker. Griffin Holt. His voice came through thin and frantic, ordering someone to kill the lights and run. He had been watching everything through a hidden camera. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the soft scent of lavender baby lotion, a combination that should never exist in the same room. As agents tightened plastic restraints around Delilah's wrists, the polished wife she pretended to be disappeared completely. She didn't cry, she snarled, her face twisted with fury as she locked her eyes on Rowan. "You're nothing," she screamed. "You're holding a stranger's kid. You don't even have rights." Rowan didn't respond. He simply stood holding Rhea securely in his arms, ignoring the venom she hurled across the room. "She's my daughter," he said quietly. "The only real thing you ever touched. There are many kinds of strength in the world. The agents with the battering ram showed one kind, but real strength is the man who walks through a war zone without letting go of a child's hand." I watched him carry Rhea toward the hallway, my vision blurring, as emotion finally broke through the discipline I'd held all night. Victory as a father doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it simply means surviving long enough to reach the shore. As Rowan stepped into the hallway, he ran his hand across Rhea's favorite stuffed bear. His fingers paused. Something hard was hidden inside the paw. He tore the seam open. A tiny tracking device dropped into his palm. The betrayal had no bottom. Delilah hadn't just planned to escape. She intended to track the child wherever she went. Moments later, Rowan stepped outside into the pale morning light. His shirt was stained with spilled coffee and Rhea's tears. He looked directly into the small camera clipped to his lapel. "It's done, Dad," he whispered. Then his voice cracked. "But we found a tracker in her bear." He glanced back toward the house. "They're still coming for her." I didn't wait for the handcuffs to stop ringing in the Portland air. I was already on the secure line with Michelle watching the digital dominoes start to topple across the Pacific Northwest. Reports flooded into the command center as the FBI hit secondary targets with the precision of a clockmaker. Griffin Holt had been apprehended in Seattle literally 3 minutes from the runway of a private airfield. And Diana Voss was caught in a Vancouver hotel, clutching a bag filled with 3 different passports and $50,000 in cash. It was a nationwide takedown, a house of cards finally meeting a hurricane. Michelle confirmed they had recovered a central ledger, a literal blueprint for misery, detailing 12 other families being systematically hollowed out. "They were planning to bleed you dry by Christmas Calder," she said, her voice heavy with the scale of it. Combined losses would have exceeded $8 million. I realized then that Delilah's marriage to Rowan was just one ugly gear in a massive predatory machine. It wasn't love, it was industrial-scale harvesting. But the victory felt hollow as I watched Rowan stare at a cold glass of water in a law office 3 hours later. You can catch the thief, but that doesn't mean you get the peace of mind back. Sometimes the trial is harder than the crime. We were sitting in the office of Sarah Brennan. Sarah Brennan was a woman who wore her reputation like a suit of armor, her eyes sharp enough to cut through any lie a witness could conjure. The smell of expensive leather and law books should have felt stable, but the air was electric with a new kind of dread. The FBI revealed an entry twist that made my skin crawl. Delilah had already pre-signed Rhea's adoption papers over to Griffin Holt in a different jurisdiction, creating a legal paradox intended to strip Rowan of any standing the moment she crossed the border. "The law cares about blood," Sarah said, her voice a low, melodic warning. "But a good judge cares about the person who changes the diapers. We have to pivot to the psychological parent doctrine immediately. If we don't, the state or Holt's remaining associates could move Rhea to a foster facility by nightfall. The law is a blunt instrument. We had to sharpen it into a scalpel before the other side used it as a hammer." Rowan's face was a mask of determined anxiety. "They're going to use that 0% DNA test to claim I'm a stranger," he whispered, the sound of a printer humming in the background, sounding like a death march. As Sarah flipped through the thick case file, her hand stopped on a specific page. The betrayal found a new depth. She discovered that Delilah's emergency custody petition, the one meant to bury us, had been notarized by my own brother Vernon 2 weeks prior. He hadn't just been a getaway driver, he had been the legal architect for our family's destruction. Sarah looked up from the file, her face draining of all professional neutrality. "Calder, there's one more thing," she said, her eyes fixed on a social security number at the bottom of a medical release. Delilah filed these papers under a different identity, one that belongs to a woman in Ohio who is still very much alive and has been looking for her kidnapped daughter for 18 months. The room went silent, the distant city sirens the only sound left in a world that had just reinvented its own horror. The silence of the Multnomah County Courthouse on Monday morning was deafening, a heavy pressure that seemed to hum in the very marble of the walls. I adjusted the knot of Rowan's tie as we stood before the towering bronze doors of the courthouse, his hands steady for the first time in a week, while a sea of reporters waited like vultures for the fall of the Whitlock name. The taste of bitter courthouse coffee lingered on my tongue, a reminder of the long hours spent with Sarah Brennan, prepping for this moment. We weren't just here to fight a fraud. We were here to save a child from being swallowed by a legal void. I gripped the cold wooden railing as we navigated the gauntlet of the lobby, the sight of the bronze statue of Lady Justice feeling more like a threat than a promise. We were led into the private chambers of Judge Holloway. Judge Holloway was a woman with silver hair and eyes like polished granite, someone who had seen 1,000 broken homes and had no patience for anything but the absolute truth. Sarah didn't waste a second. She laid out the autopsy of Delilah's identity, revealing the stolen social security number that belonged to a living woman in Florida. "This isn't just about custody or honor," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the small room. "It's about a ghost trying to claim a living child." However, the air in the room shifted when the opposing counsel presented their own motion. From her jail cell, Delilah had attempted to appoint Griffin Holt as Rhea's legal guardian, claiming he was the biological father, to circumvent Rowan's standing. It was a tactical strike intended to sever the Whitlock line entirely. The courthouse air was thick with the smell of floor wax, and old secrets, a place where families are either mended or dismantled by a single stroke of a pen. I watched Holloway's face searching for a crack in the granite, but she remained unreadable. "Mr. Whitlock, the law is interested in facts, not your professional history as a detective," she said, her eyes shifting to Rowan. Sarah then invoked the psychological parent doctrine, the pivot we'd bet everything on. She argued that biology was secondary to the primary caregiving bond, detailing the 2 years Rowan spent as Rhea's sole stable provider, while Delilah was busy manufacturing a multi-state heist. "Biology didn't read her goodnight moon 400 times, Rowan said as he took the stand. "I did. I am the only father she has ever known, and I am the only one she asks for when she's scared." Then Rowan looked the judge in the eye. He didn't look like my little boy anymore. He looked like a man who would burn the world down for his child. The room fell silent as a court-appointed advocate added that, since her removal, Rhea had been calling for data incessantly, a detail that landed like a physical weight. But the victory was short-lived. Judge Holloway leaned forward, her expression unreadable and her voice devoid of sentiment. "Mr. Whitlock, the law on biological rights is very clear. If Mr. Holt is the father, your psychological bond may not be enough to stop her from being handed to a stranger." I felt the floor drop out from under me as I realized the kingpin was still holding the high ground from behind bars. The sound of Sarah Brennan's briefcase clicking open was the last thing I heard before we retreated from the courthouse to find the ammunition we needed to survive it. DNA is just a sequence of proteins, but a fatherhood is built from 3,000 sleepless nights, and I was going to make sure the court felt every single one of them. We couldn't let Griffin Holt's biological claim stand as the final word. Back at the Whitlock home, I transformed the dining room into a tactical command center. The smell of printer ink was thick in the air, a chemical sharp contrast to the stale, lukewarm coffee sitting on my desk. Thousands of time-stamped photos and videos were spread across the mahogany table, like the fragments of a broken mirror we were trying to piece back together. Ilara sat at the laptop, the sound of her rhythmic typing a constant hum, as she meticulously cross-referenced pediatric records and daycare logs. We found that Rowan had attended 100% of Rhea's medical appointments, while Delilah was allegedly traveling for business. Every fever, every first step, every nightmare, it was all Rowan. Ilara said, her voice trembling, but determined. "We aren't just proving he's a dad, Ilara," I replied, staring at a photo of my son holding a sleeping Rhea. "We're proving she was never a mother." I uncovered an entry twist that made my blood run cold as I dug through Delilah's faked health logs. She had been systematically faking Rhea's allergies to peanuts and dairy for over a year, using them as a weapon to restrict Rowan's movements and keep him isolated from his own social circle. It was the ultimate leash. A mother's love is supposed to be a sanctuary. For Rhea, it was a ledger. By midnight, I managed to bypass the encryption on Delilah's secondary cloud drive. I sat in my study, my hand steady on the cold computer mouse as I read the archives. The clinical horror of it was staggering. In emails sent to Griffin Holt during the first year of Rhea's life, Delilah described the child as a necessary anchor and a long-term insurance policy for the Whitlock estate. She called her a leverage unit. My granddaughter was a line item on a spreadsheet to these people. How do you explain to a 2-year-old that her very existence was an investment strategy? I felt a sickening realization wash over me, followed by a surge of righteous anger that cleared the fatigue from my mind. This goes to the judge, tonight. I won't let them reduce a child's soul to a financial instrument. As I scrolled through the final documents, I found an email from Delilah to the forger that revealed the true depth of her depravity. She had actually spent months looking for a child to adopt through illegal human trafficking channels before deciding to use Griffin as a biological donor because it would look more authentic for the scam. She didn't want a daughter. She wanted a prop that shared the ringleader's genetic code. I found a folder labeled Project Exit and felt the hair on my neck stand up as the screen flickered in the dark room. Delilah hadn't just planned to take Rhea to Canada, she had planned to leave her there with Griffin and disappear entirely once the Whitlock money was laundered. Rhea wasn't even the prize to her. She was just the bait. The meeting with the district attorney's office felt like walking into a storm that was finally blowing in our favor. I carried the weight of the Project Exit files in my mind, but in my hands I carried the physical evidence of a monster. I stepped into the cold fluorescent office air, the smell of old file folders and institutional floor wax grounding me as I prepared for the final deep dive into the wreckage Delilah had created. I didn't sit down immediately. I slammed a stack of 4 different birth certificates onto the prosecutor's desk, each one bearing Griffin Holt's name and a different mother's signature, the paper trail of a man who treated fatherhood like a franchise opportunity. The district attorney was a sharp-featured woman who looked like she'd been carved out of Oregon flint, and she handled the stack of fraud reports like she was loading a shotgun. She looked from the certificates to the mugshot on her monitor, where Griffin Holt's smug smile seemed to mock the very concept of justice. My investigative deep dive had yielded a sickening pattern. Holt had fathered 4 other children across Nevada, Arizona, and California, using each one as a biological anchor to claim custody of heirs to wealthy estates. Once the assets were liquidated, he vanished. I discovered that one of those leveraged children had actually been abandoned in a Canadian hospital after the scam collapsed. He doesn't want a daughter, Michelle. I said, my voice low and dangerous. He wants a key to my safe deposit box. He's a biological donor for hire for the ring. 4 kids in 5 years, and he's never paid a dime in support or attended a single school play. How do you define a monster? Is it the person who steals your money, or the one who sires a child just to use her as a crowbar? I watched the DA's face as she absorbed the affidavits I'd collected from the other mothers. The righteous indignation in the room was palpable. We then pivoted to the Project Exit files I'd recovered from Delilah's drive. They explicitly detail Griffin's fee for providing the biological leverage needed for the Whitlock scam. The sound of a heavy stapler echoed through the office as the DA began attaching these exhibits to her motion. We're moving to terminate his rights alongside Delilah's, she said, her eyes narrowing as she read the Arizona file. He's not a father, he's a co-conspirator. Make sure the judge sees the Arizona file, I urged. The similarities are chilling. The Arizona child was named Leo. He's 6 now. He still waits by the window for a man who only saw him as a decimal point. I felt a calculated satisfaction as the final nail was driven into the coffin of Griffin's attempt to spite-take Rhea. We were stripping away the legal shield of his biological rights by proving his intent was purely criminal. But then I noticed a detail I had missed in my haste. I realized that Griffin was planning a backup move, a lawsuit for grandparental alienation, to secure a monthly settlement even if he lost custody. The greed was bottomless. The DA looked up from the Arizona file, her eyes narrowing as she pointed to a handwritten note in the margins. Calder, there's a note here. Griffin wasn't just working for Delilah. He was working for someone else, someone who's been inside your police department. The morning of the final hearing carried the same tension as the moments before a lightning strike. The air outside the Multnomah County Courthouse felt heavy with rain and anticipation. The building itself stood like a fortress of polished granite, imposing and silent. But once inside, the scent changed. The halls smelled faintly of furniture polish, old paper, and the quiet, fragile hope of people whose lives had been taken apart and rebuilt under the cold light of the law. When the gavel finally struck, the sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, like a door slamming shut on years of deception. I sat directly behind Rowan, my hand resting firmly on his shoulder. The gesture was simple, but I meant it as an anchor, something solid to hold him steady in a tide that had threatened to swallow him for months. Inside the courtroom, the silence was almost oppressive. It stood in stark contrast to the chaos outside, where reporters still crowded the courthouse steps, dissecting every detail of the scandal that had turned our family name into headline material. Sarah Brennan rose from her seat and stepped forward with the calm precision of a surgeon preparing for a final incision. When she began speaking, her voice was controlled and exact, each word cutting through the air with deliberate clarity. What followed was not a speech. It was a dismantling. Sarah presented the final body of evidence, tying Griffin Holt to a long-running scheme of biological manipulation and financial fraud. She laid out the pattern, clearly women operating under fabricated identities, children used as leverage, and carefully constructed relationships designed to infiltrate families with substantial assets. Piece by piece, she connected Delilah's false identity to the larger criminal network that had perfected the method. I noticed the district attorney lean forward as Sarah described something new, an attempt that very morning by a mole within the department to destroy files from the Arizona investigation connected to Holt's earlier operations. They hadn't counted on one detail. For decades, I had maintained redundant digital backups of every file I handled. When the system logs detected the attempted deletion, the tampering was recorded in real time. Your Honor. Sarah set her eyes steady on Judge Holloway. We are not looking at a mother and father engaged in a custody dispute. What we are looking at is a manufacturing system for leverage. She paused. The state rests its case, but this child's life is only just beginning to breathe. The silence that followed was immense. In a courtroom, silence can carry more weight than any speech. It is the moment when a person's entire future hangs suspended in the air. I felt the tension in Rowan's shoulders beneath my hand. For months he had carried himself like a man braced against a storm, every muscle holding tight just to stay standing. Judge Holloway studied the evidence for what felt like an eternity. Her eyes moved slowly through the documents stacked before her, the result of months of investigation and testimony. When she finally spoke, her words were calm but severe. For nearly 15 minutes, she summarized the case, describing the systematic violation of a child's safety and the calculated exploitation that had defined the entire scheme. Each sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. Then she delivered the ruling. The court formally terminated all parental rights of the woman operating under the identity of Delilah Mercer, as well as those of the biological father, Griffin Holt. Invoking the legal standard of the best interests of the child, the judge's voice softened only slightly as she turned her attention toward Rowan. Mr. Whitlock, she said, the law now recognizes what your actions have already proven for the past 2 years. You are her father. She paused before continuing. Parental rights are not tools to be wielded by predators. I felt Rowan's body finally break beneath the weight he had carried for so long. His head bowed, and his shoulders trembled as months of silent tension dissolved into quiet tears. My hand remained on his shoulder, feeling the deep tremor of relief pass through him. As the bailiff stepped forward, the metallic flash of handcuffs caught the courtroom light. Delilah was led toward the exit, her face stripped of its polished mask and replaced by raw fury. When she passed our row, she leaned close enough for only me to hear her. You think you won, Calder? She whispered. Her voice was cold and poisonous. Vernon wasn't just some fool I manipulated. He was already drowning in gambling debts to Griffin's people long before I met your son. Her lips curled into a bitter smile. He sold you out for a clean slate. I watched her disappear through the courtroom doors. But as I lifted my eyes, something else caught my attention. In the back row sat a man I recognized immediately, a face from my own precinct. He shouldn't have been there, and the look on his face wasn't curiosity. It was quiet, calculating anger. The case might have ended inside that courtroom, but the shadow in the back row told me the story wasn't finished yet. The walk out of the Multnomah County Courthouse felt different than the walk in the air, was thinner, cleaner, but the shadow in the back of the room still haunted my steps. I couldn't shake the memory of that face-a-cold fixture from my own precinct watching our victory like it was a personal insult. 3 months later, the Oregon rain had softened into a mild September drizzle. Adoption isn't just a legal filing, it's a soul-level correction of a biological error, and as I watched Rowan straighten Rhea's dress in the quiet hallway, I saw a man finally reclaiming the piece of his heart that a thief had tried to monetize. We were back for the final decree, the formal closing of a wound that had nearly bled us dry. The atmosphere in Judge Holloway's private chambers was intimate, a sharp contrast to the clinical brutality of the trial. Elara stood beside me, her hand resting on my arm, while Rhea explored the thick rug, with a curiosity that made the heavy mahogany furniture seem less imposing. During the ceremony, my phone buzzed with a message from Michelle. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She had identified the man from the back row as a former internal affairs investigator I had forced out of the department years ago for ethical breaches. The grudge wasn't just professional, it was a decades-old poison that had found a new vessel in Delilah's ring. I'm not taking her in because I have to. Your Honor, Rowan said, his voice echoing with a quiet, resonant strength. I'm taking her in because I'm the only one who truly has. She's been a Whitlock in her heart for a long time. Today the ink just catches up. The court-appointed advocate gave a glowing report describing a stability in our home that Delilah had spent years trying to dismantle. Ink. It's so thin, yet it weighs more than blood when it's drying on an adoption decree. I watched Judge Holloway reach for a specialized silver pen, the metal glinting under the warm office lights. The scratch of the fountain pen on thick parchment was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in years, a rhythmic final punctuation mark on my son's ordeal. Congratulations, mister, Whitlock, the judge said, handing the document to Rowan with a rare, genuine smile. You are her father in every sense the law and the heart allow. Rowan held the paper with a reverence usually reserved for religious texts, his eyes shining as he looked down at the daughter who was now and forever his. Thank you, Your Honor, he whispered, for everything. I felt an immense surge of pride, but my detective's instinct remained a jagged edge beneath my suit jacket. Can a man ever truly retire, or is the badge just something you wear on the inside of your ribs for the rest of your life? The muffled sound of courthouse traffic filtered through the glass, a reminder of the world waiting outside. As we gathered our things and moved toward the door, I leaned down to adjust the stroller. My fingers brushed against a rough paper envelope tucked into the side pocket of Rhea's seat, a dead drop I hadn't seen anyone place. I opened it to find a copy of Rhea's new birth certificate. A thick, violent red X had been drawn through my name. I looked at the red X on the document and felt the cold steel of my old life pressing back into my palm. The adoption was finished, but the war for my family's safety had just entered its final, most dangerous phase. The walk to the parking garage felt like a tactical retreat through a sniper's alley. Every shadow a potential threat, and every passing face a reminder that the red X on Rhea's birth certificate was a live wire. I spent the next few weeks in a state of controlled hypervigilance, but today I had to put the badge back on, if only in spirit. Justice in a federal courtroom doesn't move with the speed of a bullet. It moves with the crushing, inevitable weight of a glacier, and today the ice was finally set to break. I sat in the gallery of the Portland Federal Courthouse, the echoing footsteps in the marble halls, a rhythmic precursor to the reckoning. Natalie, the woman I had known as Delilah, sat at the defense table. The prosecution was relentless, stripping away her carefully crafted persona and laying bare the systematic psychological grooming she had used to hollow out our lives. A surprising detail emerged during the proceedings. Natalie had maintained a secret offshore account intended for Rhea's upkeep, proving she fully expected to keep the child as a permanent anchor even after the financial heist was complete. The judge's voice was like a hammer as he handed down the sentence. 15 years without parole. I watched Natalie's defiant mask finally crack her eyes wide with the realization that a decade and a half of her life had just been traded for a failed scam. 15 years. It's a start, I whispered to the empty air, but it won't buy back the time she took from my son. A prison sentence is a strange kind of clock. It doesn't tell you what time it is, only how much time you've wasted. Griffin Holt received 20, a heavy punctuation mark on a career of siring leverage for profit. I left the courthouse and drove toward the coast, the air getting cleaner as I pulled into a quiet veterans retirement home. Eugene Martinez was a man whose back was still straight from decades in the Corps, but whose eyes were clouded with the specific heavy fog of a man who'd been betrayed by someone he trusted. I found him in the sunroom, the smell of hospital-grade disinfectant lingering in the air. I told him about the convictions and the recovery of a portion of his laundered funds. For the first time, the shame in his eyes began to lift, replaced by the light of the afternoon sun hitting the medals on his side table. They're going away for a long time, Eugene, I said, resting a hand on his arm. You were the one who gave us the first thread. I didn't care about the money as much as knowing I wasn't crazy. He replied, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, detective. Redemption isn't a check in the mail. It's the ability to look at your own reflection without flinching. As we spoke, Eugene reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered coin. It's a St. Gaudens, he said, handing it to me. Natalie gave it to me during our first meeting. It's real. I felt the heavy gold coin in my hand and realized she'd made a sloppy mistake. She'd accidentally traded a real asset for a lie, and that single slip had led us straight to her door. I walked Eugene back to his room, but as I reached the lobby, I stopped. Outside, a black sedan with government plates was idling at the edge of the parking lot. Through the tinted glass, I saw the glint of a familiar face. The man from the precinct was inside, his eyes fixed on me with the cold, silent promise of a debt yet to be settled. The smell of slow-roasted garlic and rosemary shouldn't feel like a victory, but in a house that had been treated like a crime scene for months, it was the scent of a ceasefire. I stood by the kitchen counter, my movements practiced and calm, as I peeled the potatoes for our first Sunday roast since the scandal began. The drive home from Eugene's home had been a slow-motion scan of every rearview mirror, every intersection, and every shadow, but the hypervigilance was beginning to find its floor. I watched Alara move with a grace that had been brittle for too long. "Pass the twine calder," she said, her voice finally losing that sharp, guarded edge. "Let's focus on dinner, not the front gate." I handed her the roll, glancing toward the living room. Rowan was on the rug, his face lit by the golden Sunday afternoon light. He was laughing a real deep-bellied sound as Rhea built a crooked tower of blocks. "He looks lighter, doesn't he?" I whispered to Alara, like he's finally stopped waiting for the floor to drop. I'd officially filed the evidence against the precinct mole with the FBI that morning, ensuring the man in the black sedan would be answering to his own internal affairs investigation before the roast even hit the oven. I had turned the tables for good, and the satisfaction was a quiet, steady warmth in my chest. Steam rose from the gravy boat. For a second it looked like the fog over the Willamette, but this time nobody was hiding in it. We moved to the dining room, the table set with the good china that had survived the storm. The taste of home-cooked comfort was a revelation after months of bitter coffee and courthouse sandwiches. I touched the silver gravy boat, feeling its solid, cool weight. Midway through the meal, a silence fell over us, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind we'd grown used to. Rhea suddenly dropped her spoon, her wide, clear eyes fixing on Rowan. She reached out a small, chubby hand and gripped his thumb. "Dada!" She chirped, her voice ringing through the room like a bell. "Look, Dada." Rowan froze, his fork hovering in midair. I saw his eyes glisten as he dropped his gaze to the child he had fought so hard to keep. "I see you, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with a deep emotional catharsis. "I've got you." Is a family defined by the blood that flows through their veins, or by the courage it takes to stand at the stove and cook for the people you saved? I knew the answer as I watched them. The real resolution hadn't happened in Holloway's chambers. It happened right here in the quiet space between a father and a daughter. As we finished, Rhea wiggled out of her chair and crawled toward the radiator in the corner. She reached into the narrow gap behind it and pulled something out, her face triumphant. She toddled back to Rowan and dropped a small, glinting object into his palm. It was his missing wedding ring, the one Delilah had made him believe he'd lost during her months of gaslighting. The house was finally giving up its secrets, clearing out the last of the poison. I looked out the window one last time as the sun dipped below the trees, and for the first time in 30 years, the black sedan wasn't there, only the quiet golden light of a life reclaimed. The sound of the front door locking for the night was the final punctuation mark on a story that almost ended in silence. I watched the banking portal screen transition from a warning red to a steady rhythmic green, the digital pulse of a life's work finally returning to its rightful owner. I sat in the study, the digital ping of a successful bank transfer sounding like a chime of liberation. Rowan sat across from me, the light of the monitor reflecting in eyes that finally looked clear of the fog. Stephen Gallagher was on the speakerphone, his voice carrying a rare note of professional satisfaction. Through the federal seizure of Griffin Holt's laundered accounts, they had managed to claw back 90% of the funds Delilah had siphoned. "It's back, son," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Every penny they tried to turn into a ghost is solid again." Rowan didn't look at the numbers. "I don't care about the ledger, Dad," he replied. "I just care that she can't use them to find us anymore." Stephen then delivered an entry twist that made us both pause. The federal interest added from the seized criminal assets had actually left Rowan with a small surplus, a tidy sum that would serve as the foundation for Rhea's college fund. We spent the next hour reviewing the new legal safeguards, a fortress of trusts and alerts that ensured no single person could ever hollow out our lives again. Money is just paper and pixels until someone tries to use it as a knife. Then it becomes the most dangerous thing in the room. I felt the weight of the protection I'd provided, a heavy but necessary mantle. Later that afternoon, I carried a heavy canvas bag of coins down to my garage workshop. The smell of ozone and old metal met me as I fired up the induction furnace. I watched the fake gold eagles and lead core Morgans lose their shape, the microscopic tooling marks of the ghost watermark, melting into an unrecognizable slag. The roar of the induction furnace was a cleansing sound, the sight of glowing molten metal, a visual representation of the truth burning through a mountain of deception. "You look like gold, but you're just lead and greed," I muttered, watching the lies liquefy. Dust to dust, lie to lie. Fire is the ultimate auditor. It doesn't care about your story, only your substance. As the metal cooled into a worthless gray lump, I reached for the very last fake coin case at the bottom of the bag. Inside, tucked behind the felt lining, I found a tiny real lock of hair, Ria's first haircut. My hand froze on the cold casing. It was a final confusing fragment of a woman who was a monster, but perhaps for one fleeting minute had tried to be a mother. It was a piece of Natalie that Rowan never knew existed. I looked at the lock of hair, then at the orange glow of the furnace. I tossed the lock of hair into the furnace and watched it vanish in a puff of white smoke, finally erasing the last link to the woman who never existed, but whose wake we would be sailing through for the rest of our lives. The protection of the Whitlock legacy was no longer a mission. It was a settled fact. As the metal hardened into a dull, honest weight, I realized the ghosts were finally gone. I stood at the edge of the Pacific, the salt spray stinging my eyes as I scattered the last of Eugene Martinez's ashes into the gray surf, the final debt paid to a man who died, knowing he wasn't a fool. The sound of crashing waves against the jagged Oregon cliffs provided a rhythmic, mournful salute to a Marine who had spent his final days fighting a war he never expected to face in his own living room. The smell of sea salt and damp sand filled my lungs, a cleansing contrast to the ozone and melting lead of my workshop. Carrying out Eugene's final wish felt like closing a circle I hadn't realized was open. The recovery of his money hadn't just been a financial victory. It allowed him to die with his straight-back dignity intact, rather than in the suffocating shadow of shame. I reflected on how his small gold coin, the ghost that Natalie had sloppily traded away, was the single thread that saved my own family. To honor that legacy, I had used the small surplus from the criminal asset seizure to set up a modest scholarship in Eugene's name for children of veterans. "You weren't just a victim, Eugene," I whispered to the wind. "You were the first line of defense. Rest easy, Marine. The watch is covered." An entry twist awaited me back in my study, tucked inside a sealed letter Eugene had left with his estate lawyer. It contained a name, a silent partner in the precinct who had protected the ring's interests. My stomach dropped as I read the confirmation. The mole wasn't just a disgruntled investigator, but a high-ranking captain I had trusted for a decade. A predator doesn't go away just because you beat them. They just find a different forest to hunt in. By January, I had returned to my morning workout at the gym, where the Trojan horse had first entered Rowan's life. I moved through the rows of machines, my eyes habitually scanning the room for the time spills and the overeager smiles of professionals. I found myself watching a young man on the stationary bikes looking vulnerable and distracted, the telltale wedding ring tan line on his finger, screaming of a recent divorce. Within minutes, a woman approached him, her approach too perfect, her smile too practiced. "You think you're safe because you locked the door. But remember, the person who sold you the lock might still have the key." I didn't intervene directly. I wasn't that man anymore. Instead, I pulled my phone and made a quiet call to Michelle. "I'm at the East Side branch," I said, my voice dropping into a low, lethal frequency. "Row 4 stationary bikes. We have a live one." "Retirement doesn't suit you," Calder Michelle's voice crackled through the line. "You're still seeing the ghosts before they even appear." Maybe she was right, but as I adjusted my position, the woman I was watching suddenly looked up. She didn't look startled. She looked straight into my eyes and offered a faint mocking salute. A jolt of adrenaline, cold and familiar, spiked through my chest. She knew exactly who I was, and she wanted me to know she was there. I tightened my grip on the cold steel pull-up bar, my heart rate steadying into a lethal rhythm as I realized the ghost watermark wasn't a signature of the past, but a calling card for the future. The war for my family's legacy wasn't over. It had just evolved into a much longer game. I stood in the doorway of the nursery, the soft glow of the nightlight, carving out a world where the only thing that mattered was the steady rise and fall of a child's chest. The house was quiet now, a deep restorative silence that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in over a year. Returning from the gym, I had performed a final mental post-mortem of the case I'd codenamed 120KV7. It was a textbook study in a new kind of warfare. The anatomy of the con was a triple-threat emotional grooming to lower the defense's financial isolation to cut off support, and the weaponization of shame to ensure silence. We all missed the red flags initially, the aggressive refusal of medical history, the artificial urgency of investment windows, and the scrubbed digital footprints. They don't steal your money first. They steal your sense of reality. If the deal requires you to keep it a secret from the people who love you, it's not a deal. It's a trap. As I stood in the hallway, I thought of a secret I would carry to my own grave. I had discovered that the name Rhea wasn't chosen for its classical beauty, but because it was the name of the lead forger's mother, a final. Hidden branding meant to mark my family as their territory. My son would never need to know that. You might think this is just a story about a bad marriage, but look closely at your own accounts, your own relationships. Are you sure you know who's holding the pen? I watched as Rowan leaned over the crib, tucking the blanket around Rhea with a tenderness that made my throat tight. The smell of lavender and baby powder was thick in the air, drifting over the faint hum of a white noise machine. "She's sleeping through the night now," Dad Rowan whispered, turning toward me as I stepped into the room. The golden rectangle of light from the hallway caught the peace in his eyes. No more sedatives, no more bad dreams. Just sleep. I rested my hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid reality of the family we had fought to keep whole. "Children are innocent, Rowan," I said, repeating a Vietnamese proverb my old partner used to say. "Children are innocent. They bear no guilt for the sins of those who brought them into the world. She was the anchor they used to try and drown us, but she's the only reason we learned how to swim. She was born into a web of digital ghosts and professional lies, but tonight she was just a little girl, safe in her own bed. Blood doesn't make a father. Fear doesn't make a home. Only the truth does." We stood there for a long time, two men watching over the only pure thing to emerge from the wreckage. I eventually retreated to my study, the floorboards silent under my feet. I opened the heavy oak desk and reached for the cold metal handle of the bottom drawer. I placed my retired badge inside, setting it right next to the recovered St. Gaudens gold coin Eugene had given me. I realized then that my true legacy wasn't the thousands of files I'd closed or the criminals I'd put behind bars. It was the two people sleeping down the hall. I closed the nursery door and walked toward the stairs. The house finally silent, but in the back of my mind, I was already drafting the first line of the next file. Looking back on this family story, I realize how close I came to letting the promise of a quiet retirement blind me to the danger circling my son. After decades of police work, I believed I could finally step away from suspicion and simply trust the calm surface of ordinary life. But the truth is that predators don't always appear in dark alleys or crime reports. Sometimes they sit comfortably at your table, smiling, while the damage quietly spreads beneath the floorboards. My mistake was believing that peace meant lowering my guard. If there is one lesson I hope anyone takes from this family story, it is simple. Never silence your instincts just to avoid conflict. When something feels wrong inside your own home, investigate it. Your intuition often sees the cracks long before your mind wants to admit they exist. What unfolded in our lives was more than a financial scam. It was a devastating act of family betrayal. The most painful part was realizing that the danger wasn't outside our walls, it had been invited in with open arms. That is why this family story matters to me. It reminds me that protection is not only about locks, alarms, or security systems. Real protection is vigilance, the willingness to keep watching even when love makes you want to look away. The hardest part of confronting that family betrayal wasn't collecting evidence or working with investigators. It was accepting that evil doesn't always wear the face of a villain. Sometimes it looks like the person smiling across the dinner table passing you the potatoes during Sunday supper. People sometimes ask if this was a story about revenge. In truth, it never felt that way to me. What some might call revenge was simply a father refusing to allow his son's kindness to be used as a weapon against him. The pain of that family betrayal forced us to face an uncomfortable truth about how manipulation works. Predators depend on your politeness. They rely on your desire to keep the peace and your fear of being wrong. They expect you to doubt your instincts long enough for them to tighten the trap. Breaking that pattern means asking questions when others would stay silent, It means demanding answers even when those answers might destroy the illusion of safety you once believed in. Through everything that happened, I believe the Lord's timing revealed the truth just before the shadows closed in completely. Faith alone cannot protect a family, and vigilance alone cannot heal one. But together, they create something stronger, a partnership that guards what truly matters. Faith reminds us to hold on to hope, while vigilance reminds us never to ignore warning signs. Thank you for walking with me through every twist of this journey. I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts. If you were in Rowan's place discovering that the person you loved had built their life on deception, what would you have done? Your perspective matters, and every voice adds something valuable to this conversation. If this family story made you reflect on trust, loyalty, or the quiet dangers that can hide within everyday life, consider subscribing so you don't miss the stories that follow. And one final note, while this narrative draws inspiration from real patterns of financial fraud and family betrayal, certain moments have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this style of narrative isn't what you're looking for, that's perfectly fine. There are many other stories out there waiting to be discovered.